Today we are going to talk about module 14 sensation part 2. In this continuation of the module, we are going to focus on the objectives of knowing the other forms of sensory processes or sensory organs and how to measure the sensations. Now let us begin. Smell, taste and touch. Clearly our sensory experiences would be extremely limited without vision and hearing. But what about the chemical senses like smell and taste? Smell. If you suddenly lost your capacity for olfaction, that is the sense of smell, you might think this is not so bad. I can't smell flowers or food, but on the other hand, I no longer have to endure the foul odors of life. But your olfactory system, the technical name for the organ and the brain structures involved in the sense of smell, aids your survival. You smell smoke and can escape before the flames of a fire envelops you. Your nose broadcasts an odor alarm to the brain when certain poisonous gases or noxious fumes are present. Smell, aided by taste, provides your line of defenses against putting spoiled food or drink into your body. You cannot smell a substance unless some of its molecules vaporize, that is, pass from a solid or liquid into a gaseous state. Heat speeds up the vaporization of molecules, which is why food that is cooking has a stronger and more distinct odor than uncooked food. When odor molecules vaporize, they become airborne and make their way up to each nostril to the olfactory epithelium. The olfactory epithelium consists of two 1 square inch patches of tissue, one at the top of each nasal cavity. Together these patches contain about 10 million olfactory neurons, which are the receptor cells for smell. Each of these neurons contain only one of the 1000 different types of odor receptors. Because humans are able to detect some 10,000 odors, each of the 1000 types of odor receptors must be able to respond to more than one kind of odor molecule. Moreover, some odor molecules trigger more than one type of odor receptor. The intensity of a smell stimulus, how strong or weak it is apparently determined by the number of olfactory neurons firing at the same time. Have you ever wondered why dogs have a keener sense of smell than humans? Not only many dogs do have a long snout, but in some breeds, the olfactory epithelium can be as large as the area of the handkerchief and can contain 20 times as many olfactory neurons as in the humans. Engen, 1982. It is well known that dogs use scent to recognize not only other members of their species but also the humans with whom they live. Humans have this ability too. The mothers of newborns can recognize their own babies by smell within hours after birth. Olfactory neurons are different from all other sensory receptors. They both come into direct contact with sensory stimuli and reach directly into the brain. These neurons have a short lifespan. After functioning for only about 60 days, they die and are replaced by new cells. Bensefe et al., 2004. The axons of the olfactory neurons relay a smell message directly to the olfactory bulbs, two brain structures the size of a matchstick that rest above the nasal cavities. Smell sensations then travel to the amygdala, part of the limbic system, and the nearby olfactory cortex. Olfactory messages leave the amygdala and the olfactory cortex via two pathways. One of these pathways carries smell sensations to other parts of the limbic system for emotional interpretation. The other pathway sends olfactory information to the cells in the thalamus that relay it to the orbitofrontal cortex for cognitive interpretation. The process of sensing odors is the same in every individual, but there are large differences in sensitivity to smells. Young people are more sensitive to odors than older people, and non-smokers are more sensitive than smokers. Boyce and Schoen, 2006, Danielitz et al., 2009. Taste. You might be surprised to learn that much of the pleasure you attribute to the sense of taste actually arises from smells. When odor molecules are forced up the nasal cavity by the action of the tongue, cheeks and throat when you chew and swallow. Even without a sense of taste, your sense of smell would provide you with some taste sensation. Still, life without the ability to fully experience the taste of food we love would no doubt be less enjoyable. It was long maintained that gustation, the sense of taste, produced 4 distinct kinds of taste sensation: sweet, sour, salty and bitter. This is true, but researchers now know that there is a 5th taste sensation in humans. This 5th taste sensation is called as umami. It is triggered by the substance glutamate, which is in the form of monosodium glutamate, is widely used as a flavoring in Asian foods. Many protein-rich foods such as meat, milk, aged cheese and seafood also contain glutamate. All 5 taste sensations can be detected on all locations of the tongue. Indeed, even a person with no tongue could still taste to some extent thanks to the taste receptors found in the palate, in the mucous lining of the cheeks and lips, and in parts of the throat, including the tonsils. When tastes are mixed, the specialized receptors for each type of flavors are activated and sends separate messages to the brain. In other words, your brain perceives the 2 distinctive flavors present in sweet and sour sauce quite separately. This analytical quality of the sense of taste prevents your being fooled into eating spoiled or poisoned food when the characteristic taste of either is combined with some kind of pleasant flavor. If you look at your tongue in a mirror, you will see many small bumps called papillae, which helps to mucus of food dissolved in saliva across the surface of the tongue. Taste buds lie alongside some of these papillae. Each taste bud is composed of 60 to 100 receptor cells. The lifespan of the taste receptors is very short, only about 10 days, and they are continually being replaced. Non-tasters are unable to taste certain sweet and bitter compounds, but they do taste most other substances, albeit with less sensitivity. Super tasters taste these sweets and bitter compounds with far stronger intensity than other people. Researchers are currently investigating links between taste sensitivity, eating behavior and health status variables such as obesity by Tepper 2008. So, researchers know that taste sensitivity is linked to food preferences, but not how these preferences may be connected to nutritional status. Touch and pain. Your natural clothing, the skin, is the largest organ of your body. It performs many important biological functions while also providing much of what is known as sensual pleasure. In addition, the skin's unpleasant sensation can alert us that something is wrong in our bodies. Touch, tactile information, is conveyed to the brain when the object touched and depresses the skin, stimulating one or more of the several distinct types of receptors found in the nerve endings. These sensitive nerve endings in the skin send the touch message through nerve connections to the spinal cord. The message travels up the spinal cord and through the brain stem and the midbrain, finally reaching the somatosensory cortex. The somatosensory cortex is the strip of tissue at the front of the parietal lobes where touch, pressure, temperature and pain register. Once the somatosensory cortex has been activated, you become aware of where and how hard you have been touched. The measure of how far apart 2 touch points on the skin must be before they are felt as 2 separate touches. If you could examine the skin from the outermost to the deepest layer, you would find a variety of nerve endings that differ markedly in appearances. Most of all these nerve endings appear to respond in some degree to all type of tactile stimulation. The more densely packed with these sensory receptors a part of the body's surface is, the more sensitive it is to tactile stimulation. For instance, the fingertips have more touch receptors than other parts of the body. Pain. Scientists are not certain how pain works, but one major theory attempts to answer the question is the gate control theory of Ronald Melzack and Patrick Wall in 1965 and 1983. These researchers contend that an area in the spinal cord can act like a gate and either block the pain messages or transmit them to the brain. Only so many messages can go through the gate at any one time. You feel pain when pain messages carried by small, slow conducting nerve fibers reach the gate and cause it to open. Large, fast conducting nerves fiber carry other sensory messages from the body. These can effectively tie up traffic at the gate so that it will close and keep many of the pain messages from getting through. What is the first thing you do when you stab your toe or pound your finger with a hammer? If you rub or apply gentle pressure to the injury, you are stimulating the large, fast conducting nerve fibers which get their message to the spinal gate first and block some of the pain messages from the slower conducting nerve fibers. Applying ice, heat or electrical stimulation to the painful area also stimulates the large nerve fibers and closes the spinal gate. The gate control theory also accounts for the fact that psychological factors, both cognitive and emotional, can influence the perception of pain. Melzack and Wall, 1965-1983, contend that messages from the brain to the spinal cord can inhibit the transmission of the pain messages at the spinal gate, thereby affecting the perception of pain. This phenomena explains why soldiers injured in a battle or athletes injured during games can be so distracted that they do not experience pain until some time after the injury. Likewise, distraction can be an effective pain management strategy. But what about long-term pain? Not surprisingly, distraction is of little use in managing the ongoing pain of conditions such as arthritis, chronic inflammation of the joints. Still, there are psychological techniques that help. Strategies such as relaxation techniques provide some relief for the anxiety associated with chronic pain. Singh et al. 2012. However, they do not seem to actually prevent pain sensation. Intense type of pain seems to be resistant to psychological management. However, research indicates that women who use them are no less likely to request pharmacological pain relief than are those who do not. Nevertheless, these strategies help women manage the anxieties associated with labor and delivery. Measurement of sensation. Absolute thresholds. An absolute threshold is the smallest intensity of a stimulus that must be present for it to be detected. In fact, our senses are so fine-tuned that we might have problem if they were any more sensitive. For instance, if our ears were slightly more acute, we would be able to hear the sound of air molecules in our ear knocking into the eardrum, a phenomenon that would surely prove distracting and might even prevent us from hearing sounds outside our bodies. Of course, the absolute threshold we have been discussing are measured under ideal conditions. Normally, our senses cannot detect stimulation quite as well because of the presence of noise. Noise, as defined by psychophysicists, is background stimulation that interferes with the perception of other stimuli. Hence, noise refers not just to auditory stimuli, as the word suggests, but also to unwanted stimuli that interfere with our senses. Signal detection. One of the early goals of psychologists was to measure the sensitivity of our sensory systems. This activity led to the development of the idea of a threshold, the least intense amount of stimulation needed for a person to be able to see, hear, feel or detect the stimulus. Unfortunately, one of the problems with this concept was that even though the levels of stimulation remained constant, people were inconsistent in detecting the stimulus. Factors other than the sensitivity of sense receptors influence the signal detection process. There is no single fixed value below which a person never detects the stimulus and above which the person always detects it. In general, psychologists typically define threshold as that intensity of a stimulation that a person can detect some percentage of the time. An approach to resolving this dilemma is provided by signal detection theory. This approach abandons the idea of a threshold, instead treating detection of the stimulus as a decision-making process, part of which is determined by the nature of the stimulus, by how sensitive a person is to the stimulus, and by the cognitive factors. In other words, a person will be able to detect more intense sounds or lights more easily than less intense stimuli. Further, a more sensitive person requires less stimulus intensity than a less sensitive person would. Finally, when a person is quite uncertain as to whether the stimulus was present, the individual will decide based on what kind of mistake in judgment is worse. To say that no stimulus was present when there actually was one, to say that there was a stimulus when in reality there was none. In a typical sensory experiment that involves a large number of trials, an observer must try to detect a very faint sound or light that varies in intensity from clearly below normal detection level to clearly above. The person responds positively, that is, there is a stimulus, or negatively, that is, there is no stimulus. There are two possible responses, yes and no. There are also two different possibilities for the stimulus, either present or absent. The accompanying table describes the combination of an observer's response and whether the stimulus is actually there. The table refers to the task with an auditory stimulus, but it could be modified to involve stimulus for any sense. Psychologists have established that when stimuli are difficult to detect, cognitive factors are critical in the decision an observer makes. If a person participates in an experiment and receives 100 rupees for each hit and there is no penalty for false alarm, then it is in the person's best interest to say that the stimulus was present whenever there is uncertainty. On the other hand, if the person loses 100 rupees for each false alarm, then it is better for the observer to be cautious in saying that a stimulus occurred. This combination of reward and penalties for correct and incorrect decisions is referred to as the payoff matrix. If the payoff matrix changes, then the person's pattern of responses will also change. This alteration in response is called a criterion shift, as shown in the figure. There is always a trade-off between the number of hits and false alarms. When a person is very willing to say that the signal was present, that individual will show more hits, but will also have more false alarms. Fewer hits will be associated with fewer false alarms. As such, the number of hits is not a very revealing indicator of how sensitive a person is. If the person claims to have heard the stimulus on every single trial, then the person will have said yes in every instance in which the stimulus was actually there. This is not very impressive, however, because the person will also have said yes on every trial on which there was no stimulus. Psychologists have used mathematical approaches to determine the sensitivity of an individual for any given pattern of hits and false alarms. The index of sensitivity is called as D prime. A large value of D reflects greater sensitivity. The basic idea behind signal detection theory is that neurons are constantly sending information to the brain even when no stimuli are present. This is called neural noise. The level of neural noise fluctuates constantly. When a faint stimulus or signal occurs, it creates a neural response. The brain must decide whether the neural activity reflects noise alone or whether there was also a signal. For very intense signals, there is no problem in deciding if there was a stimulus because the neural effect of the signal far outweighs the neural effect of the noise. Similarly, when there is no signal, the nervous system does not respond as it does when an outside signal is present. So, decisions are easy. Difference threshold. Suppose you wanted to choose the 6 best apples from a supermarket display, the biggest, the reddest and the sweetest apples. One approach would be to compare one apple with another systematically until you are left with a few so similar that you could not tell the difference between them. At that point, it wouldn't matter which one you choose. Psychologists have discussed this comparison problem in terms of the difference threshold, the smallest level of added or reduced stimulation required to sense that a change in stimulation has occurred. Thus, the difference threshold is the minimum change required in stimulation required to detect the difference between two stimuli, and so it is also called as just noticeable difference. Notrower, Lowenstein, 2007. The size of a stimulus that constitutes a just noticeable difference depends on the initial intensity of the stimulus. The relationship between changes in the original size of a stimulus and the degree to which a change will be noticed forms one of the basic laws of psychophysics. Weber's law? Weber's law states that a just noticeable difference is a constant proportion of the intensity of an initial stimulus rather than a constant amount. Weber's law helps explain why a person in a quiet room is more startled by the ringing of a telephone than is a person in already a noisy room. To produce the same amount of reaction in a noisy room, a telephone ring might have to approximate the loudness of a cathedral bells. Similarly, when the moon is visible during the late afternoon, it appears relatively dim, yet against a dark night sky, it seems quite bright. Sensory adaptation. You enter a movie theatre and the smell of popcorn is everywhere. A few minutes later, though you barely notice the smell, the reason you become accustomed to the odor is sensory adaptation. Sensory adaptation is an adjustment in sensory capacity after prolonged exposure to unchanging stimuli. One example of adaptation is the decrease in the sensitivity that occurs after repeated exposure to a strong stimulus. If you were to hear a loud tone over and over again, eventually it would begin to sound softer. Similarly, although jumping into a cold lake may be temporarily unpleasant, eventually you will get used to the temperature. This apparent decline in sensitivity to sensory stimuli is due to the inability of the sensory nerve receptors to fire off messages to the brain indefinitely, because these receptor cells are most responsive to changes in stimulation. Constant stimulation is not effective in producing a sustained reaction. Judgments of sensory stimuli are also affected by the context in which the judgments are made. This is the case because judgments are made not in isolation from other stimuli, but in terms of preceding sensory experiences. So, in this part of module number 14, sensation, we have discussed about the other forms of sensory organs and their impact on our experiences, and how the measurement of sensation is done to understand the world around us.